This happened when I was 11. I have an older brother who was 16 at the time and two younger brothers. My parents would often go out for dinner on a Friday, leaving us at home with some pizza to watch TV. My older brother was in charge. He would often leave to his friend's place down the street and put me in charge. I liked this because I enjoyed being in charge and got to pick the movies. That Friday night was stormy, with rain coming and going, lightning flashing, and thunder rumbling. I was watching a movie while my two younger brothers played in the carport. It was a large open area big enough for 4 cars. Since Mom and Dad weren't home, we used it for skateboarding, bike riding, and other activities. There was so much room for fun. Our carport faced a park. We didn't have neighbors on that side, so the footpath often saw people walking dogs, cycling, or jogging under the street lamps. The park was a great place to grow up near, and our driveway led straight into it. My brother had written his friend's number down before leaving and told us to call if needed. I was deep into our second movie when my younger brothers ran in, saying there was a man watching them from the park near our fence. At first, I thought they were joking, but their faces told me they weren't. I followed them out to the carport. Looking out toward the park, I didn't see anyone at first. Then, during a flash of lightning, we saw him, standing in our yard, watching us. We screamed, slammed the door, and ran to our parents' room. Locking the door, we grabbed their phone, pulled the cord into the bathroom, and locked ourselves in there too. I called my brother's friend's house. His friend answered, and I told him there was a man in our yard. He yelled for my brother, and they rushed to us. It felt like forever, but they arrived within 5 minutes. They told the friend's parents, who called the police and came over. When my brother and his friend arrived, they called out to us, letting us know they were there. The man had disappeared by then. Soon after, the police showed up and searched our yard, house, and the surrounding streets. It was a scary night, but having the police and my brother back made us feel safer. When my parents came home to police cars and neighbors gathered in the driveway, I imagine their hearts must have been racing. They never mentioned whether the man was found or caught. Years later, my dad told me something chilling. After I moved out, my younger brother, who had taken my old room, woke my parents one night, white as a ghost. He said a man had been at his window, waking him by saying, "Hey boy, are your parents home?" My parents didn't tell us kids about it at the time. Not long after, they replaced the big open fly screen windows in our rooms with glass louvers and metal security bars. Looking back, it makes me shiver to think how close those encounters were. I'm 24 now, but up until 3 months ago, I lived alone with my dog Bear in a cozy townhouse. I moved in at 22, excited to have a place of my own thanks to my steady job. It was my first rental, and I loved it. The peace and independence were perfect, until one terrifying night changed everything. It was a gloomy, rainy evening. I had the day off and was relaxing in the living room, scrolling through my phone. Around 8 p.m., just an hour before I'd usually head to bed, Bear started whining by the back door. This was his way of letting me know he needed to go outside. I got up, opened the door to the backyard, and stood in the kitchen while he did his thing. My yard had a small fence, so I didn't worry about Bear wandering off. For context, Bear isn't a big dog. He's small, fluffy, and more teddy bear than guard dog. Barely 20 seconds after letting him out, I heard Bear let out a sharp whimper followed by a bark. It wasn't his usual bark. It sounded scared. My heart jumped as I rushed to the door. Bear was running back to me, tail between his legs. I quickly let him in and leaned outside to look for what might have frightened him. I scanned the yard but didn't see anything. I locked the door and tried to comfort Bear, but his behavior worried me. He's usually calm, but for the next half hour he kept staring at different windows and doors. His ears perked up like he was on edge. Then, about 45 minutes later, Bear suddenly growled and stared at the window behind me. His growl turned into a low rumble, and his ears flattened. I turned to see what had caught his attention, and froze. There, just feet from us, a man was standing outside the window, staring right at me. He was so close his face was nearly pressed against the glass. I screamed and stumbled back as the man bolted, sprinting down the side of the house. Bear barked like crazy as I closed the blinds and checked every window and door to make sure they were locked. My heart was pounding. I didn't recognize the man and had no idea what he wanted or why he was staring into my home. The rain outside drowned out any other sounds, making it impossible to tell if he was still lurking. Bear eventually calmed down, but I couldn't relax. When I finally went upstairs, I brought Bear with me. It took a long time to fall asleep, but exhaustion eventually won. Sometime in the night, I woke up to see Bear standing at the bedroom door, staring at it. He looked tense, his ears twitching. Before I could process what was happening, I heard voices. 2 men were talking downstairs, not whispering, but speaking loudly enough that it was clear they didn't care if I heard them. My stomach sank. My bedroom door was locked, but that didn't feel like much of a barrier. Grabbing Bear, I hid in the corner of the room behind the bed. The voices stopped abruptly, and the silence felt heavier than the rain outside. I pulled out my phone and called the police, whispering as softly as I could while giving my address. Bear growled again, then barked as I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I froze. Then one of the men called out, "Hey, we just want to talk. We're not here to hurt you." My hands were shaking, but I shouted back, "I've called the cops, leave now." There was a pause, then another voice said, "We're here to help you." I didn't respond, trying to stifle my crying as Bear whined softly in my arms. After what felt like forever, I heard one set of footsteps retreating downstairs. The silence was unbearable. I strained to hear any sound of the other man leaving, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the rain. Eventually, the sound of sirens broke the tension. Relief flooded me as the footsteps downstairs turned into running, but I was still terrified. Where was the second man? When the police arrived, they searched the house and found no one. They did, however, find wet footprints throughout the house and an unlocked window. They assured me the place was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, hiding. I moved out 3 months ago. The fear, the unanswered questions, and the thought that neither man was ever identified or caught were too much to live with. Even in my new apartment, miles away, I sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder or feeling like I'm not alone. I work at a small convenience store on the corner of a shopping strip, a more local version of a 7-Eleven. For a while, I took on morning shifts, which started at 3 a.m. and ended at 1 p.m. I liked these shifts because they were quiet and easy, with only a few tasks like serving customers, stocking shelves, and taking out the trash. Most of the time, I had nothing to do. This happened in the middle of winter, though where I live, it usually rains instead of snows. It was lightly raining that night, which kept most people away. During quiet mornings, I would step outside and smoke to pass the time, not exactly allowed, but no one was there to stop me. The shopping strip had about 8 or 9 other stores, all of which opened later, usually around 6 or 7 a.m. While I was outside, I saw a car pull into the lot. Assuming the driver was coming into the convenience store, I stubbed out my cigarette and went back inside. Minutes passed, but no one came in. Curious, I walked back to the front door and looked outside. The car was still parked nearby, but its headlights were off, and I didn't see anyone inside. The rain made visibility worse, but it seemed odd. After looking around and seeing nothing, I went back to my station. About 30 minutes later, nothing had changed. I was standing behind the counter, zoning out, when I decided to gather the trash from the bins around the store and take it to the dumpster out back. As I was collecting the trash, I heard a faint click outside. It sounded like something snapping or breaking, but with the rain hitting the roof, it was hard to pinpoint. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just one of the many random noises these old buildings make. After loading the trash into a cart, I rolled it to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the now heavier rain. The dumpster was directly across from the door. After tossing in the bags, I turned to go back inside. That's when I noticed something odd. The door to the store next to mine was slightly open. It was strange because that store never opened until 6 a.m. at the earliest, and the lights were off. I went back inside to dry off, and then walked to the front to get a better look. The neighboring store still looked empty and locked up from the front. Curious, and with nothing else to do, I went back to the rear of the building to check again. The door was still open, so I stepped just inside, staying in the doorway to avoid looking like I was trespassing. The room I stepped into was dark and seemed to be a small closet or storage area with another door leading deeper into the store. From inside, I could hear someone moving around, footsteps, drawers opening and closing, and the distinct sound of items being moved or dropped. "Hey, is everything okay in there?" I called out, trying to sound casual. The noises stopped immediately. A wave of unease hit me, and I backed out of the doorway, stepping into the rain. Something was wrong. As I glanced back at the door, I noticed it had no handle, just a jagged hole where the handle and lock should have been. The wedge holding the door open? It was the broken handle. I hurried back to my store, locked all the doors, and called 911-1. Then I called my manager to let them know what was happening. While waiting, I pressed my ear against the wall that connected our stores. Whoever was inside must have realized I'd called the police because I could hear them moving frantically, running, throwing things, and making a mess. After what felt like forever, I saw flashing lights and heard sirens. The footsteps inside the neighboring store moved toward the back, and soon I heard officers shouting commands. I stayed inside until things calmed down, then went outside to speak with the police. The man they arrested had a pillowcase filled with nearly $6,000 worth of stolen items, an empty firearm, and tools for breaking locks and doors. They told me he'd also broken into another store 2 doors down. Thankfully, it didn't seem like he intended to break into my store, though the police found scratches on my back door handle, suggesting he might have tried at some point. Even now, the thought of what could have happened makes my skin crawl. I used to work at a hotel and found myself in a number of strange situations, more than I'd like to admit. One night, while working the front desk, I noticed a man walking back and forth past me several times. He didn't appear to be doing anything outright wrong, but something about his behavior struck me as odd. He seemed to be looking for something or someone, and his repeated pacing made me uneasy. After he passed by for the 5th time, I finally decided to address him. "Excuse me, sir, do you need help with something?" I asked politely. The man stopped, turned, and gave me a disgusted look. Without saying a word, he turned back around and continued walking. It was strange, but I decided not to call security yet since he hadn't done anything alarming. Still, his presence put me on edge. A few minutes later, he walked outside. I hoped that was the end of it, but it wasn't. About 5 minutes after he left, the hotel phone rang. I picked it up. "Hello, how can I help you?" There was no response, just heavy breathing on the other end of the line. "Hello, is anyone there?" I asked again. When no one replied, I hung up, assuming it was a prank call. We received prank calls from time to time, and while annoying, they weren't out of the ordinary. Then the phone rang again. This time, I answered with a slightly irritated tone. But instead of silence, I heard a woman screaming on the other end. She said she needed help, that she was outside in the parking lot, unable to walk because she'd been hit by a car. The driver had fled, leaving her there. She described herself as wearing a red dress and claimed I'd spot her easily. Then she described the man who hit her. Tall, bald, middle-aged, wearing a black coat and blue jeans. Her description immediately matched the man who'd been pacing in the lobby earlier, the same one who gave me that strange look. Something about the whole situation felt off. I thought it was odd that she called the hotel instead of the police. Still, she was pleading for help, and against my better judgment, I decided to step outside to check. When I stepped out, it was raining. I scanned the parking lot looking for her. At first, I didn't see anyone, but eventually, I spotted a woman in a red dress. She wasn't lying down or injured as I expected. Instead, she was standing near a car, talking to someone. That someone was the man from earlier. The moment he noticed me watching, he moved around to hide behind the car. The woman then took a few steps away, lay down on the ground, and started screaming like she was hurt. But then she looked directly at me. I think she realized I had seen everything, the staged conversation, her suddenly injured act. Without hesitation, I turned and ran back inside, locking the door and calling the police. As soon as I did, they bolted from the parking lot, disappearing into the night. The entire situation was unnerving. I don't know exactly what they were trying to pull, but it felt like an elaborate setup to lure me outside. To this day, I still work at that hotel, but I haven't seen either of them again. The memory of that night sticks with me, a chilling reminder to always trust my instincts. It was a cold and rainy night, and I was huddled up in my jacket at the bus stop, waiting for the bus to arrive so I could finally go home. I wasn't sure how long he had been standing there because I wasn't paying much attention. When I looked up from staring at the ground, I quickly noticed a man standing across the street staring at me. He was just standing there on the sidewalk in the pouring rain. The sight of him gave me an uneasy feeling, but I had no choice but to wait for the bus. Unfortunately, it took another 10 minutes to arrive, and every passing moment felt excruciating. The man's presence was unsettling enough, but then he crossed the street and started walking toward me. When he reached me, he sat down on the bench, right next to me. What made it even more uncomfortable was the fact that the entire bench was empty, yet he chose to sit so close that only 2 inches separated us. He didn't say a word. The silence between us felt oppressive as the minutes dragged on. Finally, the bus arrived. I felt a wave of relief. I quickly boarded and walked toward the back, choosing a seat near the rear. In hindsight, I should have sat in the very last seat, but for some reason, I didn't. The man followed me onto the bus and sat just 1 seat across and 1 seat behind me. I could feel his gaze burning into the back of my head. Every time I turned to look, he was staring directly at me. I already had a bad feeling about him, but when I moved to the front of the bus at the next stop, he followed me again, sitting even closer this time. My anxiety skyrocketed. Thinking quickly, I decided to text my mom. I told her about the situation and let her know I wasn't going home. Instead, I planned to get off at a different, more populated location to avoid leading the man to where I lived. At the next stop, I got off the bus, hoping I'd finally lose him. Unfortunately, he got off with me. Panic set in. Desperate, I decided to walk back onto the bus, thinking he wouldn't follow. But he did. I sat down briefly, and moments later, I saw him climbing back up the steps. As soon as he sat down across from me, I jumped up and stormed toward the bus driver. "I'm sorry," I said urgently. "I need to get off here." The driver stopped, and I bolted off the bus. Looking back, I saw the man was still on it. He tried to get off with me again, but the bus driver closed the door before he could. I don't know if the driver realized I was being followed, or if he was simply annoyed by us getting on and off repeatedly, but that decision might have saved my life. As the bus pulled away, I looked up and saw the man standing at the emergency exit window at the back of the bus. He was staring at me, holding a knife in his hand. I don't know what he had planned, but I'm thankful I never had to find out.